Hey everyone. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah? We're good? Okay. Well, thanks so much for having us today. My name is Kevin.
My name is Michael.
We're going to kind of be doing this back and forth presentation thing today, so we're going to rearrange just a little bit. Bear with us. There we go. We're alien visitors disrupting the stage ecosystem as you go through. What it means for us to be here right now is just kind of absolutely beyond words. We both dreamed about attending this symposium the past 2 times, and now we have the opportunity to present here, and we've been here for these 2 amazing days so far, so it's just been absolutely phenomenal. And this is beautiful. This setup, I have never seen this level of setup in American symposia or conferences. And we're so happy that you brought the shrubs out for us tonight, too. You know, this, who set this up? Are you here? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've been just blown away by this whole thing. So we were able to kind of con our way onto the stage tonight because we wrote this book called Shrouded in Light. We really extol the beauty and the ecological complexity of shrubland plant communities. And we like to explore some of the philosophies and the strategies that can really help us kind of better appreciate them, understand their lessons, and use them as inspiration to create these dynamic and resilient gardens, some words we've heard a lot over the past 2 days. But kind of in the spirit of going beneath the surface, that's not all that we really want to talk to you about today. So has anyone ever read The Shining? Or more importantly, have you seen The Shining? Right. So, because they're 2 different things. The film adaptations tend to fall, really short of the books, but in this case, Kubrick really took what King did and made it his own complete entire vision. If you're unfamiliar, right, it's the story of this family that's kind of terrorized with supernatural horror in a Colorado mountain town, and it's actually set not too far from where Michael and I live. I've never been haunted in the mountains, but they're still pretty powerful places. King famously hated Kubrick's interpretation of the book, right? He called it a great big beautiful Cadillac with no motor inside. King wrote The Shining to be kind of semi-autobiographical. It explored his own alcoholism, his own abuse, his own cycles of abuse, and in doing so, in writing this, he tried to kind of expose that pain, and he wanted to kind of take it out of his life and shield his family from it. He considered this book kind of a pyre for his own flaws, and he really, really resented the changes that Kubrick made to the story. For Kubrick, the story of The Shining was nothing more than a vehicle. It was a means kind of to his own end. He used King's traumatic supernatural environment to kind of discuss the layers upon layers of themes that he saw really pertinent to the world. He looked at cycles of violence inherent in generational hate, colonization and genocide, patriarchal dominance, governmental deception, entitlement to power, of course, racism. He used it to kind of illuminate the mazes and the loops that we get stuck in as societies and individuals, and even the loops that we get stuck in as professionals. So we really thought a lot about Kubrick's strategy when we were writing this book, and we wanted to do something of our own. To us, Shrouded in Light really didn't need to be only about shrubs and shrublands. Right? I think as this community that we are as professionals, we didn't think that we needed to write another book just to list out hundreds or thousands of shrubs. We didn't need another book to give deeply instructional planting advice or really, design guidance. All those things already exist, right? Almost all written by people that spoke at the symposium or are in this room kind of right now. And they're brilliant, right? There's so many brilliant books explaining the perennial planting strategies, design techniques, ecosystem types, and so many floras and monographs and nursery catalogs with endless lists of plants. And we're really all standing on the shoulders of giants. We're standing on so much information. And we just didn't think that we needed to recapitulate that. We wanted this book to be a vehicle for different things. And it just so happens that shrubs and shrublands and ecological planting design are just fantastic entry points to have these new horticultural conversations. And as we found out over the past 2 days, and as we've been having, we need to have these new conversations because all the old ones are just kind of keeping us trapped in mazes. Shrublands are themselves a type of maze, or depending on your perspective, they might be more of a type of labyrinth. Right? Both are very similar from a technical distinction. Mazes have multiple starting points and endpoints, labyrinths have only one, but both can really symbolize a myriad of things all wrapped up in each other, right? We use them historically, spiritually, to symbolize life's journey, pilgrimage, searching, progress and setbacks, the endless and the end, right? Self-determination and fatalism. The maze is really a home for all these contradictory things to live together. Michael and I were trapped in our own mazes, right? Just like many of us are. We're personally, professionally, philosophically, and of course, in many ways, we still are. But sometimes when we enter one maze and leave another, we're able to gain enough perspective to kind of see our previous patterns. We love this Wallace Stegner quote. We use it in our book, and we really feel its truth kind of reverberated throughout our lives. Stegner writes, "We're creatures shaped by our experiences. We like what we know more often than we know what we like." Right? We know what we've been exposed to, what we've been taught to see. Sometimes we just like what we've been told to like. And these preferences can often just kind of blind us or keep us from observing or accepting a lot of our surroundings, or even make us kind of actively block out the things that we're unfamiliar or uncomfortable with. And this is especially true regarding landscapes and gardens. Michael and I both grew up here, or in places close to here, in rural upstate New York, in landscapes like this, honestly not very dissimilar from what we've seen in England so far. These kind of deciduous forests and dense woods, broken mostly just by towns and farms and abandoned agricultural fields. And this is where our ecological and our horticulture and our aesthetic training really started, kind of amidst this lush sea of green. And our eyes were really trained to these dominant plant communities and these plant forms. But then we moved to Colorado, and our minds got blown wide open. And we started our Western explorations, and we both had the same sort of amazed, visceral reaction to our new surroundings. We were shocked by the starkness and the beauty in this environment. It was so much different from what we had known, but it was also so dramatic and compelling. On the steppes of Colorado, we saw shrublands, scenes like this. We saw shimmering, light-drenched silvers. In this case, these are the ubiquitous kind of workhorses for us, Ericameria and Artemisia. They're often thriving when everything around them is just kind of burnt up by summer drought. These things just knocked us out when we saw them. Even a bit higher in the mountains, in the dry montane scrublands, we saw these multi-stemmed trees, Amelanchier, Juniperus, Quercus, and it really challenged our ideas of scale and morphology of forests and made us ask, are these actually trees? Even in the greener, kind of wetter mountain biomes, we had these lush combinations of Dasyphora, Symphoracarpos, and Salix. They just seemed exciting and eternal and so far removed from the pedestrian and kind of rote uses that we had seen them mostly assigned to in our landscapes. And on top of the world, in Colorado, we have 14,000-foot peaks. We saw this in the alpine tundra, these subshrubs of ribes and dryas and vaccinia, making these mycelial-like expanses, stabilizing the rubble, and we just had these visions kind of fill our mind of the world covered in these cushions. And then also in the Great Basin, we were scrubbed and smudged by 1 million square kilometers of Artemisia raging in what we call the Great Sagebrush Sea. Our immersion in the shrublands of the western US was really life-changing. I think that's probably obvious, but their undeniable and pervasive presence really sort of activated our shrubland recognition systems, right? We were not attuned to this before, but now we kind of saw them everywhere. And in our personal or professional travels, we really found ourselves lost in this huge intercontinental hedge maze. We saw them in our neighboring deserts, where we were kind of subdued by these washed out earthy tones. These are plants Atroplex and Larea. They appear so smoky and diaphanous against this really hardened, reddened land. Next to that, in the dry desert forest, we saw the bold colors of Arctostaphylos and Yucca, creating this kind of scrubby defensive understory beneath this canopy of Hesperociperus. We witnessed the knotted tapestry of Eriogonum and Bacchus and Ceanothus. This makes up the coastal soft sage scrub. It runs for hundreds and hundreds of miles along the Pacific coast. And then the almost unbeatable, untoppable Mediterranean chaparral of California is just held us absolutely captive by their beauty. We're also snagged in in wetter environments, very, very different than other parts of the Southwest. This is Oplopanix horridus, the devil's club, and just its brilliant fall colors. This rain-drenched, ericaceous-laden forest floor up in the Northwest. We saw the humid, tangled pocosin. This is a shrub swamp in the American Southeast. ilex, cerilla, and clethra, all kind of laced through with really caustic toxicodendron shrubs. And then sometimes in person, sometimes from afar, kind of through the photos and the accounts of others, we were also able to travel and experience other places not in the US, right? These are the arid acacia woodlands of the Australian outback. We wandered through the rich heathland tapestries of temperate Europe. And we scraped our bodies through the pungent sclerophyllus scrub of the South African fynbos. We eyed these thorned chicken wire mesh euphorbias of the Grecian frigana. And we tripped on this acid-dipped azarella scrubland in Patagonia. Right, we saw the clematis and rhododendron wonderlands of Tibet. And we were eaten alive and terrified in the dense thorn scrub of tropical Mexico. We also noticed the glossy leaves of these shrubs lighting up the understory of deciduous forests, and their bristling darkness exposed by intense and persistent radiation in the deserts. We met these impossibly ancient creatures at the edge of dry woodlands. They're as big and tortured as humans. We walked through shrubland communities more expansive than any of our cities or suburbs. And we examined the minuscule worlds of what we call nanoscrub, these tight, self-contained places, really easy to walk right over, but really holding the very building blocks of our Earth together. Essentially, we saw shrublands everywhere. We saw them in places called grasslands. We saw shrublands in national forests. We saw this sort of complex and important ecosystem, both holding its own definite space and also ambiguously weaving into the space of others.
So we began to think about these landscapes and spaces that we were seeing, the sort of time scales that they were existing on, and on the environments that they emerged in. And we sort of found it useful to engage in a bit of classification into two distinct but kind of fluid categories of shrubby occurrences, the model shrubland and the alternative shrubland. So a model shrubland, as we see it, is a classic, stable shrubland biome that exists where environmental conditions basically put these plants under almost constant and considerable stress, and landscape succession happens very slowly, if ever. For example, the extreme pH ranges of a heathland, the aridity of the desert, and the wind-blasted coastlines are all host to very long-lived, stable shrublands. These shrublands are also really, really extensive, covering huge swaths of continents and running for thousands of miles along the world's coastlines. Alternative shrublands, as we call them, on the other hand, exist in more limited spaces, liminal conditions, or kind of shorter time scales. They're kind of nestled or play at the edges of other plant communities. And these shrublands often depend on disturbance events like fire, flooding, grazing, people, to create extreme or abnormal conditions that interrupt some sort of ecological stable state. So the idea of alternative shrublands also embraces that plant forms and morphologies that might act like shrubs and kind of form extensive communities, but might not be recognized by most people as such. Like clonal trees, for example, connected by underground root systems, or on the opposite end of the size spectrum, mat-forming, multi-stemmed woody perennials. With all the shrubs kind of surrounding us on our journey, we had to ask ourselves, why did it take most of our lives to see these patterns? And recognize the omnipresence of these creatures out in the world. Why do they go so often underperceived? And where are all the shrubland gardens? So traditionally, many shrublands in the wild have been considered difficult places. Scenes like this are described as maybe challenging, tangled, illegible. In a garden, we would consider this maybe unappealing or cluttered. And from a human perspective, kind of lacking the discernible layers that we crave. This is a rhododendron thicket in West Virginia in the United States. And we love rhododendrons, right? And azaleas, they're widely embraced in horticulture, but in these natural communities where you find them in the wild, they know nothing of plant spacing requirements and vertical layering. These thickets were called rhododendron hills, actually, by early American colonists, and were considered very impenetrable, inhospitable places. Landscapes like this, which are comprised of more open scrub, which is kind of commonly encountered in coastal habitats or in drier places, haven't fared much better. So agriculturally, they're perceived as unproductive, right? Trash plant wastelands, too woody to graze, too thick or thorny to navigate, and these are the kind of places that are often left as public ground or national forest in the United States, places that aren't really even worth selling or owning. So these kind of cliches, these prejudices, we think really distract from the deep kind of ecological connections, the stunning beauty and enduring productivity of shrublands around the world. And unfortunately, this might be one of the biggest reasons why we've never really embraced shrubland archetypes in our design landscapes, haven't embraced them as models for naturalistic design. These just haven't been seen as places that hold much value. So on the other hand, we've had a much easier time adapting grassland, foreland, and forest and savanna systems even, into our gardens because maybe they're reminders of kind of abundance for humanity. Kind of conjure images of fire-regimented hunting grounds, agricultural and pastoral scenes, right? These are the kind of scenes that promise harvest, security, comfort. And they're spaces that exalt human control, we've been talking so much about today. Landscapes of ease and relaxation. And maybe it's that our memories of shrublands collectively go a bit too deep, maybe, and they're disconnected from kind of our agricultural full taming of the earth. They kind of belong to this pre-agrologistic era of hunting and gathering. Maybe it was a less stable time for humanity, but if we're able to kind of view them through that lens, we can connect and kind of remember the role of shrublands and the development that they had as their role in our development as a species, really. And then maybe they can be places of abundance even. So, historically shrubs have been providers of fuel, forage, harvestable animals, and even a well-pruned shrub in the wild might indicate a nearby browser, right? Like an elk or deer, perfect hunting ground. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? And the bushes are full of birds, insects, rodents, lizards, hedgehogs, apparently, we heard today. And in fact, in his brilliant new book, Hedgelands, Christopher Hart explores the mostly discarded practice of creating kind of living, mixed species, woody habitat hedges throughout the United Kingdom, kind of extolling on their wide-ranging virtues from habitat creation, crop production, and really argues that we need to make space for them again and live among these more complicated biotic structures. And he points out, as others have today, that these are really only replacements or stand-ins for the kind of vast thorn scrub that covered most of the United Kingdom during the Holocene period 12,000 years ago, and really only changed because of anthropogenic forces and the decline of megafauna and things like that. And one of the major theses in Hedgelands is that shrubs are caretakers. They're caretakers for all life. Shrublands have actually some of the highest animal biodiversity outside of our tropical ecosystems. And this is partially due to their complex vegetative structures, which allow them to harbor high numbers of animals and plants. And this applies whether a shrub is dead or a hedge even is dead or alive, or both. And so much of the work that folks are doing here in the audience is beginning to show that. And this is partly because of the persistent branched forms of shrubs, right, which slow the air in their boundary layer. They cast these diffuse shadows, creating microclimates of higher humidity, rich layers of duff. And then as animals kind of scurry, eat, defecate in these spaces under shrubs, they kind of deposit seeds and fertilizer at the base of them. And this kind of acts as a nursery for the next generation of plants. And this so-called nurse plant phenomenon was first observed in the Sonoran Desert in a relationship between saguaro cacti and desert shrubs of creosote and mesquite. And it's actually since been identified in shrublands all around the world. And really that these facilitative effects are really crucial for maintaining diverse ecosystems. And that's in contrast to those competitive and stress-tolerating adaptations that we hear so much about in naturalistic plant community design. So we end up with kind of an interesting convergence, which is that inherent in these natural aesthetics of shrubs and shrublands are the aesthetics of all life. And by accepting them, we're accepting maybe a deeper understanding of what beauty is, beyond just what makes us and what makes people happy. And maybe to make something really beautiful, we need to think about what other beings find beautiful, what they find useful, what attracts them. We need to make and encourage non-human spaces, even if those things might sometimes actually make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. These feelings of discomfort or hesitancy, they're common emotions that we face in all sorts of wild spaces, right? Or places where we're not in full control or don't feel like we're in full control, or we don't sense that like omnipresent dominance of human influence. And this is partially what makes these places also kind of thrilling and exciting. But unfortunately, we don't tend to kind of intentionally evoke these feelings of discomfort in our garden spaces. And in fact, we kind of actively avoid them. There's kind of a tired dialogue that gardens are spaces for healing, for comfort, for pleasure. And don't get us wrong, that's absolutely true. But we think we need to make and allow for gardens that connect with a deeper spectrum of human emotions. We need to validate the greater states of being inherent in the human experience, in the full range of emotions, and celebrate gardens that are places of growth and change just like human beings are. Complex and challenging gardens often force us to face these spaces as others, independent entities that aren't just built for human purposes, right? They're alive with their own intentions and their own secrets. In shrubs and shrublands, we feel are a great entry point for having this conversation and introducing these ideas in gardens, because shrubs are really kind of weird creatures with some sort of weird social properties. You know, generally speaking, shrubs they're not the flora that we walk over. They're not the flora that we walk underneath. They're the flora that we walk alongside, that we walk with. They take up our space in the world, right? We like to think of them as anthropoflora, vegetation that's kind of human-scaled. So if trees are kind of fodder for our agricultural systems, and trees are the gods, really, then shrubs are kind of our equals. And maybe that's an intimidating or discomforting thought to interact with. And shrubs are really an intermediate growth form, right? There's something in between. They're an idea more than anything else. It's sort of real, of course, but also imposed by these human categories, these a priori categories that we put on the world. And like so many organisms, they exist on a spectrum of thoughts and realities. And when we kind of try to define them, box them in, we end up kind of misrepresenting some of their true characteristics. So we repurposed this, what we think is a poignant idea from Timothy Morton's brilliant book called Dark Ecology. Morton says that so many ecological beings are excluded middles. So much of ecological action is in the realm of not quite, slightly, gradations of yes. Shrubs live in this world of excluded middles. They're slightly what they are, they're slightly what they're not. They can be awkward or gangly, cute, monstrous, and because they exist at our scale, right, often, and they reflect some of our own qualities, they're able to sort of inhabit this perceptual phenomenon known as the uncanny valley. You know, the more something looks like us, while not totally approximating us, the stranger it can make us feel. But we don't often face this. Just like the kind of Disney-ification of emotional states evoked by gardens, we tend to deny or erase the weirdness, strangeness of shrubs and many plants by kind of turning them into these cartoony, easier forms or states, forcing them to become strange, isolated, commodified kind of zoo creatures. In this case, the infamous green meatball. So if this is sort of our traditional culture in horticulture, then maybe we need to think about a new culture.
Thanks. And what do we need in order to change our culture? We need new language, right? We need to allow for new language and new ideas. And we've had a bunch of great new words kind of thrown at us tonight. I think, Eddie, did you coin one earlier? I forget. Is that someone coined a new word in their talk? Yeah. Because language and culture are so closely connected. Language really shapes how we perceive the world. It reflects our values, preserves our traditions, it gives us identity. It can also uphold our prejudices. It can narrow our ability to describe new experiences. It can trap us in sort of the paradigms that we're currently thinking in. It's comforting and kind of reassuring to work within the known, but we should always be examining whether or not our thoughts and our work are just kind of stuck in a maze. In Shrouded in Light, we use Shrublands to examine different terms that we might be able to use to better understand plant communities and kind of the future of landscape building. We look at necroarchitecture of ambistatic life, so to just really consider creatures that contain both living and dead parts, very much like the bogs, right? We look at polychronal life forms with body parts composed of different ages, yet kind of all living in harmony together. We offer up hardcore punk and black metal as artistic references to kind of better understand our ideas of no-control garden implementation, which we've heard a lot about this half of the afternoon, and also to kind of accept and understand alternative aesthetic outcomes that we might be used to, right? There's a beauty in these other cultures and these other subcultures. We also turn to and incorporate a lot of terms and ideas from the philosophical post-humanities, which were mentioned yesterday, which we really think could have some profound implications for how we create and understand and accept gardens. To us, this is the beneath that's beneath all the beneath we've been talking about, right? It's changing our entire perceptual framework. This is a relatively new strain of philosophy. It deals with the idea that recognition of awareness and inclusion morality should be extended beyond just humans. At its base, it invokes something called object-oriented ontology, which seeks to hold all things equal. In this philosophy, a philodendron is just as important as a prime minister. Right? A privet hedge and a car are kind of siblings. A garden can be both this singular entity and a collection of beings that tend to add up to something much greater than their whole. Doesn't this seem to kind of resonate, right, with our work and our thinking, what we've been discussing? This philosophy recognizes that others, as in non-human others, do exist and they have rights and they influence in this world. This is a decentralization of human importance that I think in some form has always been present in horticulture, right? The fascination with and the honoring of other creatures, for us, mostly plant life and plant communities, it's really central to our work. We garden because we love these creatures, right? And they deserve to be loved and to be here as much as we do. And we don't need further justification than that. I think this is a really useful thought for garden making. And if we can kind of accept this philosophy as the basis for our work, then we can dig a lot deeper. It's absolutely brimming with incredible ideas that could really radically change how we garden. One is called the preservation of finitude. It offers that our relationship to something can't be translated as complete knowledge of that thing. And it has this related idea of withdrawal, which brings this a little bit further. This allows an object to be both independent from other objects and from its own actions and appearance. So something cannot, in effect, be only what we perceive it to be. Plants aren't reducible to our uses, our categories, or our designations for them. And we can really take advantage of that by embracing and celebrating the unplanned actions and the effects of gardens instead of just running to control things all the time. This philosophy also proposes breaking the law of non-contradiction, which allows for some kind of seemingly contradictory elements to be true and for something to be both itself and not itself at the same time. This can really help us to either, however you look at it, break apart or bring back together that dualistic concept of nature and human culture. And it also recognizes the kind of complicated nuances of our concepts of ecology. Logical absolutes basically have very limited applications in our big squishy world. Right? This is an open logic that kind of allows us to ask questions about subjective truths instead of making universal prescriptions. The idea of veering is the understanding that nothing in this world has a truly rigid definition, right? We exist in a spectrum of identities, states, motives, and purposes, and we can switch between them as much as we want. A species is just a point in time, right? Not a genetic end. Many plants can be both dead and alive at the same time, and we don't have to reconcile this back to a binary state. Veering allows us to really understand this fluid nature of being. One of my favorites is attunement. Attunement happens when we really take on and sense the energy and appearance and intentions of another. And in those moments, we start to develop a slightly bigger understanding and connection with that thing. In other words, we kind of veer towards something else, and in that process, we absorb a bit of it. And when we garden, we begin to understand the world through whatever plant or plant community we're working with. When we garden for something else, we're kind of attuning with that thing, whether it's other humans or wildlife or pollinators. Attunement is really how we begin to better understand and build gardens of connection. The mesh is the idea of connected diversity. It exists in the space kind of in between objects. The mesh helps to bind everything together and is kind of the underlying goal of true ecology. It helps to create a space where the living and non-living can come together. Symbiosis is a term that describes collectively, Symbiosis is a term that describes collective systems that don't have spatial or temporal boundaries. It really describes the influence and control of what happens in these places being distributed among the components that make up the collective. I forget the term that was said in one of the last sessions. It was something like parallel development or something. These systems are evolutionary. They have the potential for surprising change. To us, this is very much the definition of a garden. I think we should be gardening for symbiosis. And all these collectively producing systems and communities can become hyperobjects, which are things that are so massively distributed throughout space and time that they often transcend our understanding. And global warming, or climate change as we call it, is in itself a hyperobject. Microplastics being distributed across the surface of the Earth, cosmic background radiation, the bacterial genetic flow, and from our subjective viewpoint, the evolution and movement of plant life on this Earth is also a hyperobject. And we think that understanding this can really help us connect with the time scale of plants, with that green time, and really connect to the bigger processes that we need to accept our gardens, that will really inform them being part of the greater patchwork of life. And for us, all these concepts lead to the idea of refuge, of acceptance and regeneration and hope. Refuges are places of ecological and biological and philosophical diversity and recovery and reworlding. They're places where everything can kind of develop and grow and heal and recover while still being a part of the world. Isn't that the type of space our gardens should foster? And so these are all big ideas, right? And there are a lot more if you get into the books here. And I know it can be kind of strange to consider how they could immediately apply to gardening, but a lot of them currently do. And we currently do garden with ideas, right? Nativity and invasion, something we've been talking about a lot. Formalism, naturalism, post-wildness, bioregionalism, food security, climate change, water conservation, pollinator diversity. These are all huge ideas that drive our gardening practices with more history and honestly varied intention behind them than we really want to admit. So if you leave here with nothing else today, we'd like you to leave understanding that we garden with ideas before we garden with plants. So to paraphrase this quote by Donna Haraway, it really matters what thoughts think thoughts. And we have this really interesting example kind of happening right now of the power of thoughts and ideas kind of making worlds playing out in the digital realm, right? Where we have these artificial intelligence programs that are creating feedback loops of human culture and just kind of creating this entirely new force on our perceptions and our opinions. Using these large language models and deep learning modeling software, these programs are kind of writing the future based fully on our words and our concepts and knowledge of both the past and the things that we're presently making. And we are really interested in seeing kind of how these tools would interpret shrubland gardening. And so we kind of prompted OpenAI to make these images to kind of just reflect back what the current zeitgeist is of what shrubscapes could be. And we received these kind of evocative glimpses into our collective understanding of what we could do with them. And then kind of feeding back into that loop by asking AI to create gardens, we're asking them to kind of learn what it would consider a shrubscape based on our own work in the physical realm. And they're just full of all the limitations, the expectations, the creativity, all of our hope for the future really wrapped up in these images. And now that they've been willed into existence, and because of our keyword inputs that are tagged with the images, they now exist as kind of these further interpretations of these communities, and they'll continue to be looped back into future iterations, which could be hopeful to you, it could be terrifying to you, right? Not because you're like scared of Terminator and Skynet, but because you understand that this is a limitation in some way, right? This is a reminder kind of the importance of continuing to add to the conversation of collaboration and cross-training and discipline mixing. When we subscribe to a set of beliefs, we kind of refine and define our language and just wind up kind of spitting out jargon, right? We're doing nothing but limiting the possibilities of the future, which kind of brings up an interesting thought. Right? Should we just abandon human language altogether? No? In another post-humanist work called How Farce Thinks by Eduardo Kohn, which really invokes the semiotics work of this 19th century philosopher named Charles Peirce. Charles Peirce suggested that we really acknowledge representational forms that go beyond human language. Kohn talks about three kinds of language: symbolic and iconic and indexical. Written language is symbolic, right? It's a type of sign that bears no resemblance to the thing that it's representing. For example, the word fire doesn't look like a fire. Iconic language is based on signs that have a direct physical resemblance to the thing it's representing. An icon of fire looks like a fire. And indexical is a type of language that provides information about the thing being represented. For example, a symbol of smoke kind of indicates that there's a presence of fire. All life uses iconic and indexical signs as part of their communication strategies. Only or mostly humans just use the written symbolic. This is all about understanding that different beings, even those that we consider non-living beings, have ways in which they communicate and understand the world. This is a visual, kinetic, and non-verbal interspecies language, and these expressions are just so important. In other words, do weird shit. Right? When Michael and I wanted to find out what it was like to be a shrubland growing on the side of the road covered in trash, we covered ourselves in trash and sat in a shrubland on the side of the road. Making gardens, physically making and tending the world around us is one of our best ways to communicate with all the other beings on this planet. But it can be difficult to conceive of this, especially when you're in the throes of designing a garden. So sometimes we just need some strategies to kind of tap into the knot of the plant world and translate that to our work.
So one of the strategies we like to use is abstraction. The patterns and language of wild systems are really often so intricate and complicated that they might appear unreadable or chaotic to our eyes. Imagine trying to describe this scene using only symbolic language, like Kevin was talking about. So much would be lost in that description. So we use abstraction throughout the book to highlight the unique kind of spatial patterning that underpins these natural communities and helps make them feel more attainable in a garden setting. We call them extracts. And here we touch kind of on the expressionist or neo-expressionist movement with these kind of Keith Haring-esque little shrubland cartoons. They're only geometric simplifications, but they can be used layouts to transpose the effects of landscapes elsewhere, like into our gardens. So, for example, this heathland in the Saco Preserve in southern Maine in the United States is an incredibly complex system. Hundreds of species interweave here. And untangling this into a legible design might feel a little bit daunting. Or it could be pretty simple. So leatherleaf or Chamaedaphne colliculata kind of separates the other shrubby masses here in red, creating these islands of contrast and accumulation. And maybe a few well-placed upright shrubs with like kind of fasciated habits could help break this up and add dimension to the maelstrom. Maybe this works well for a gardener at home who wants to kind of retain the illusion of some control but flirt with wildness, because it provides kind of these distinct spaces for species while still allowing for action and kind of evolution of the garden space. But like we've heard about today in a couple of the panels, control is tricky. And the key is not to control this as a final outcome, but let the plant's natural kind of interactions play out. And that's how we think that you can recreate this kind of thing in spirit and energy, even if not in exact plant placement. So at the opposite end of the moisture spectrum and the opposite end of the North American continent is the California chaparral. Chemise, or Adenostema fasciculatum, here is the dominant player. It's got delicate white flowers and rosemary-like foliage, and it's this uncomplicated hook that cuts through these heavy rifts of buckwheat and salvia. The really heavy western light here kind of might obscure some of the patterning, but once it's teased out, something like animal skin or camouflage emerges. These are just jumping off points, things to think about before diving deeper into your own methods for sewing intricacy into your garden. But we don't necessarily even need to look at plants or plant communities to plan a garden or understanding wildness or surprising action. Wildness actually exists all around us. So wild systems emulation is a design technique we talk about in the book that really seeks to look for visual examples of surprising action as jumping off points for garden design, for the arrangement of a design. They can be the result of intentional forces or unintentional forces, really from any source you can imagine. And it really hinges on this redefinition of wild we do in the book to mean something that's simply surprising. And it can allow a much wider ranges of sources beyond just what we call nature. What we found is that using these snapshots of constantly changing systems to guide the placement of plants and plant communities in our cultivated landscapes kind of has this short-term effect of creating a garden that feels like it's already in motion when it goes in, and a long-term effect of encouraging that evolving, competitive garden. So for example, living art systems out in the world, like graffiti, probably mimic natural plant communities and the movement of species better than anything else created by humans. It's impulsive writing, plastering, it's active. There's a new bloom or population scribed on this surface in every moment, right? We'll never be able to find this moment again, and therefore it's so much like a garden that's alive. Even the composition of our cities, crumbling, is more alive than some of the gardens that we create. This is a slab of concrete, and it's been worked on for years with salt, acid, oxidation, soil chemicals, and microorganisms, and it's created this beautiful patina. The patterning here offers universes within universes. We kind of ask the question of how many universes are in your garden and who's creating them. On the most superficial level, but we think on actually a really, really helpful level, camouflage patterns are also great garden designs. They're amorphous blobs, swaths, blots that reveal patterning and repetition, rhythm, there's positive space and negative space, in kind of this semi-randomized layout. This is a translation of naturalistic distribution patterns, which is kind of hard to do. Humans always seek to impose pattern. The deeper implication in personal camouflage is that we're able to, there's times where we actually want to disappear into the environment, into the plants in their various stages of life. And when we use camouflage, we imbue ourselves with the properties that we perceive in plants, much like the attunement Kevin was just talking about, with their innocuousness, with their peace, protection. And we actually use this position sometimes to create danger, death, which are actually also underperceived but very real properties of plants as well. We can also look to something like lichen, a symbiotic holobiont of algae, fungi, and yeast. that although it is much like a DNA conglomeration of our own bodies, it's just still insane to think about. Using lichen as the basis for design kind of puts a starting point of our work in a complex system already, in a collaborative decision-making process that's managed by multiple organisms in a non-centralized kind of way. And we've even used more traditional fine art medium to emulate wild systems. Here, the intention, the malintention, the success and failure of human fiber art creation is paired with the randomness of the cyanotype to create something beautiful and complicated. So taking influence from these systems might seem really abstract or nothing to do with gardens, but we kind of think maybe that's the point. So starting in this place with less personal control as designers maybe can help kind of soften our expectations about that outcome, a word that we've heard a lot during the symposium, and learn how to maybe partner a little bit better with gardens that we make that evolve over time. And we've actually applied this system to a number of design sites in some very uncomplicated ways.
So just very quickly, this screen is flashing at me. We're going to show you this last bit here. This is Summer Home Garden, which is a public pocket park in Denver, Colorado. It's a shrubscape that has its plant palette based on shrubs from the Southwest and Colorado's Eastern Plains. It was based on this. This is a piece of graffiti, obviously on this utility box. It's been battered and painted and spray painted and just brutalized by the elements for years. This is kind of this urban collage that no singular being or person or force could have planned. It was used in the design essentially just laid out in a little 2D way, and the plant groupings were randomly laid out within the spatial suggestions of this marking. And the result was a very bright and immersive space, kind of full of its own agency. The plants of the shrubscape tend to push and drape their forms and textures all over each other. They create this unified, emotive mass with constantly changing interest that shifts and builds from the first bulbal emergence to really those final autumn flashes. This place has a real true wildness to it that's kind of lodged itself in the middle of this very urban environment. And it's gone from a property that takes from its ecosystem to containing dozens, if not over 100, 200 species that really give back to the entire surrounding space. And a funny thing about this garden, the owner will tell me all the time that she hates some of the plant choices that I made for the garden, but she still loves the garden as a whole. Specifically, she breaks my heart, but she doesn't like the rabbit brush or the Perovskia that's in it. She thinks that they're too common, kind of too mundane, but she still understands what the species do, what they provide, and kind of how important their presence is, even if she still has a little bit of difficulty with it. And to me, that's fine, right? That's her kind of loving something even though it's different from her, even though it's different from her expectations. You know, it's important that this space isn't just pleasing to her, right? Because it's not just built for her. It still challenges her ideas of what garden is or what it has to be. This is kind of part of what we've been talking about, part of that anthropocentric apocalypse, right? The relinquishment of control, the decentralization of human importance, and the lessening of the influence on our biosphere. You know, it's a good thing because it means that we're learning to partner with our cohabitants on this planet again, and we're learning to accept them. So we just really believe deeply in inspiration over instruction, and we'd encourage all of you to just set something in motion, right? Start somewhere and end up somewhere else. Above all, do what you want. Live with intentionality. Don't serve someone else's agenda, and really just embrace your role as a human messing around on this earth. You're gonna make some beautiful things. You're gonna make some ugly things, but you're gonna make something. You're gonna create something for yourself and for others. And as you kind of design and build and destroy and impose the will of these future kind of nature cultures into existence, just consider the awesome partner that you have in the beauty and the complexity and the perseverance of Shrublands. So thank you.